everyone. So good to see some familiar faces here, and I see some names as well, and I hope to meet with you at some point. Thanks for joining us during this lunchtime webinar. A couple of logistics things before we get started. If I could please ask you to mute yourself, and then we will have an opportunity to chat, and then at that point you can unmute yourself. The session will also be recorded. The only part that will not be recorded is the breakout rooms. I'm very pleased to see you all here. I will, for those who don't know me, I'll introduce myself. I'm Klodiana Kolomitro, and I'm the Director of Educational Development with the Office of Professional Development Education Scholarship. I have to say that our faculty is responding with a lot of compassion right now, and really in this session, we just want to leverage and build on that and focus on the human elements of our practice. And I'll let my co-facilitator to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Wanda Beyer. I'm the Associate Director of Instructional Design and Curriculum Development at Arts and Science Online. And I'd have to echo Klodiana's words. We've been reaching out more and more to our on-campus faculty and moving from on-campus teaching to remote learning, and I've been so impressed with instructors' compassion and care for students and the flexibility that flexibility and along with innovation around how we can do this to support our students. So I'm really hoping that we can build upon ideas that we're presenting today from what's really happening on the ground. So thanks everyone for being here. Okay. Oh, thanks, Klodiana. I forget that I can't control that. So if I don't move ahead, we're
no worries.
And it sort of speaks to some of the wonderful things that are happening, I think, from our perspective is this really great collaboration. And as everybody knows, we kind of joke about Queens being always working in silos. And I have to say the past few weeks, it's been so great to reach out to colleagues to say, hey, what are you doing over there? And hey, I've got this resource and let's share. And I think, for example, Klodiana and I being able to do this webinar together is just a great example of some of the collaboration that we see happening. So today's session, what we're really hoping to do is frame it from the perspective of these three components that you see on the screen here, having social presence, teaching presence, and cognitive presence. And how we find that balance in the efforts to create a community of our learners, but also to enact on the principles of what that means in terms of remembering them as humans and humanizing our teaching approaches as well. But we're framing it under these three presences. And we'll talk about these each a little separate and then build in some examples along the way and then hear from you from what you're doing as well. So to get us started, to warm us up, to bring us present into the moment, which I always sort of think is a good way for us to begin. We have so many things happening in the world. I know there are days that I go right from, feeding my kids to dealing with a tantrum and then, hey, hi, here I am to present. And so we're in a range of different emotions. So if we could just pause and think about, if you were to think about a feeling today at this moment, what number would it be? And I encourage you to put it in the chat. And if you don't know where that chat feature is, there's a little bubble at the bottom of your screen that says chat. So feel free to place your number in the chat. And if you're feeling brave and you're feeling like you want to share with the group as well, we can ask you to unmute your microphone and then we can sort of gauge where folks are at today. I see a number of great numbers coming in. And I have to say, when I at the end of last week, I was at about a 12. And now as the days are getting nicer and we're getting more adjusted, temporarily adjusted to this, I'm feeling less like a 12 and more along the 3. So hopefully that's happening for some of you as well. And there's a range, right? Pensive.
And it's interesting, Wanda, how I felt maybe more than one of this at the same moment, because things are changing minute by minute. So I felt I went from a 2 to a 6 to a 3 all in the span of 5 minutes. Oh, there is not a picture of someone eating lunch. That's a good one. Yes, yes. But how do you feel? How do you feel as you're eating lunch?
That's right. Is it a quick scarfing down a granola bar right before you have a session? Is it pausing for at least 10 minutes to eat something? Mm-hmm. All right, I think everybody had a chance. It's hard to run the session and see I forget some of these things sometimes. So a various range, right? Everything from 7, or forgetting something to eat. Yes, sometimes we forget that as well.
Yeah.
So 7s and 9s and 3s.
And there are a couple of reasons why we're starting with this, is that later on in the session, we'll actually reiterate the importance of checking in. And there are different ways to do this check-in. Some are more quick than others, but we'll talk about different strategies to check in with your learners.
That's right. And part of it too is that, hey, look, at somebody else is feeling that same way I am today, and that's okay.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Exactly. We thought we'll start off with delving a little bit into the why, and why are we talking about this, and why does this matter? And there are 2 questions here. What challenges and pressures are you experiencing in your teaching during the COVID-19 crisis? But as a follow-up to that, I'm hoping that it's not all negative, that you're seeing some opportunities. So what successes and opportunities are you experiencing in your teaching during the COVID-19 crisis? And if you're not directly teaching the semester, you're supporting others in their teaching, what are some of the perceived challenges that you see the people that you're supporting facing, and what are some of the successes and opportunities? So what we've done, we've set up a Google Docs, and I'll pull it up right now. What we've also done, you'll find in the chat forum at the very beginning, the link to that Google Docs. So if you go back to the chat, and I'll try and type it again, if I can. There, chat. Here's the link. If you're able to open the chat and then click on the Google Docs. Please feel free to email or text any of us privately, and then we'll get you there. Oh, I see some people have already logged in. Okay, excellent.
I like watching all the anonymous animals as well. It's kind of fun.
So let's take a couple of minutes and see what's coming up. What are some challenges and pressures that you're experiencing in terms of teaching, and what are some successes and opportunities? Lack of routine. Oh, I would echo that so much, that lack of routine, not just in my professional life, but in my personal life as well.
Mm-hmm. We forget how important that is to our day-to-day function sometimes.
Yes, clinical experience, viable replacements. And there are some competencies that could be captured through alternative assessment, but not everything is feasible or doable, or we don't have the infrastructure set up to capture some of those clinical experiences. Ah, okay. Let's come back to that, the communicating with students. They're not responding to emails. And that makes it very difficult to get a sense of how are they feeling? How are they coping? What's happening in their lives? Having to adapt quickly without an opportunity for a lot of thinking about decisions. Yes, I feel that same way. That reflection is almost missing right now, because we're all on the go, adapting and changing. Very reactive rather than anticipatory. Is setting realistic expectations of students in this time. And that's something that you'll hear us mention throughout the session as well. Not all the learning goals are viable or relevant anymore. Some of the expectations are no longer reasonable. Time zones, yes, the logistics always gets in the way. It's hard to gauge how they're doing in class, and it's even harder in a virtual environment. Yeah.
Oh, I see someone's mentioning the balance between trying to work remotely and trying to teach, and then trying to do our jobs as parents or caregivers. That's a really tricky balance right now.
I'm going to turn my attention quickly to some of the successes and opportunities. Office hours are working differently. So reframing the office hours, more informal and relaxed instruction. Right, showing some of our own, telling some of our stories and showing our own vulnerabilities. Like I could check in, actually more humanizing. Okay. I'm finding that as well, how the faculty are really stepping up to the plate with this. We're quickly adapting, we're quickly learning new technologies, and we're genuinely worried about our students and their well-being and their learning. Maybe one last minute just to finish those last thoughts there. And then if this is useful to you, we can curate and share this and maybe some of the conversations that will be happening in the breakout sessions. Opportunities to rethink a course, absolutely. So the question is no longer how can I teach what I used to in an online environment, but the question now is what actually is relevant to the students? What do they need to know in the midst of this crisis? For sure, I see some comments in the chat forum. So for those who are not able to log into the Google Docs, I'm happy to share this document. Okay. So feel free to add on as you can think of other things. I think we can see from your question, from the comments there, that a lot of those things resonate with each of us and in our roles as educators and teachers ourselves, but also supporting others in their teaching. And we do see some opportunities, but I had to say the list of the challenges and pressures was quite long and longer as it is, where we are off balance. We are in times where the stress, anxiety, uncertainty has increased drastically, and there are risks for the students and risks for us as well.
I keep forgetting to unmute my mic. Okay, so the first piece we're going to look at is really how do we bring our social presence to a remote teaching situation. And we know from studies that students in online learning communities tend to feel isolated, they tend to feel disengaged, and then they have that sense of loneliness. So how do we sort of flip the script for them and make sure that our presence that we bring in an online format helps to thwart some of these other things we know that studies have shown us increase when students are working online?
And this is important because I'm giving this example. I don't know how many are familiar with the big white wall. I mentioned this last week as well when I facilitated the session on wellness, but this is an online mental health community The CEO for Third Factor mentioned that they had seen an increase of 150% in utilization last week compared to other weeks. Again, it goes on to show that we are experiencing more stress and anxiety, and students and others are reaching out to this virtual mental health communities and how they can be of support. So what we thought we'll do, we will start with the online social presence, and at the end we'll present the literature as well. So if you want to dig deeper, then we can share those resources with all of you. And I've provided here, it sounds a little bit like definitions, but I thought we'll start with unpacking what we mean by online social presence. Because that identity that we have in a face-to-face environment, it actually looks very different in an online environment. So online, we have what we call this online persona. So you'll see different terms being used, online persona or online social presence. And there is actually a ton of literature on those concepts. But to put it in a simple way, online social presence is really described as the degree to which participants are able to present themselves effectively within the medium. So how are you presenting and engaging with others in an online environment? So the degree to which you're able to present yourself effectively affectively within that medium. The degree of awareness of others in this interaction, so how aware of you of the presence of others, and the perceived degree that actually the other person is a real physical person in either those synchronous sessions or those asynchronous communication episodes. So if, say, your learners perceive you as a real human being when you're emailing them, when you're sending them information on where you're trying to communicate with them in a synchronous environment. And I was glad actually to read, I don't know who put that comment in the Google Docs, but somebody said that actually these Zoom sessions, or whichever platform you're using, it doesn't have to be Zoom, but in this Zoom sessions, you feel that you are demonstrating your human side. So there are more human elements to your teaching because of the environment. And I find even when I'm presenting myself, I mean, people actually have access to my house. I'm inviting them to my home, so they see a different side of me. So that degree to which you are perceived a real person, that degree to which you can connect affectively in the medium, and the degree to which you're aware of the presence of the others and their contribution in the online environment. Why should we care about this? I mean, it goes without saying that the higher the degree of online social presence, the more likely students are engaged and the more their learning will be enhanced. And there is actually literature to support that the instructor degree of social presence enhances student learning. So it helps to develop community and that sense of belonging, that I'm actually part of this, I belong here. It helps to increase engagement and it deepens understanding. And I don't know, I mean, many of you are familiar with Wenger's work on communities of practice. And what Wenger said is that there are two key elements to that communities of practice. And the first one is the making meaning from abstract conceptualization. So how can you construct meaning? And the second element is the effectiveness of engagement. So how well can you engage others? And there are probably other benefits to really trying to think about your online social presence, what that look like, and perhaps how might your online identity shift or be different from your face-to-face identity as an instructor?
Okay, so if you notice here, there's like several personas, traits, characteristics that you may want to consider as you think about what your online persona could be. And I know when I first started working in an online format, one of the things that was really hard for me was to bring my energy forward. I'm a high energy person in front of a classroom, and I feed off the energy of my students as well, and I infuse it into my students. And so that shifted dramatically for me when I first started teaching online. So it was a little bit of a challenge to figure out, well, who am I online? Who do I want to be online? What are traits that resonate with who I am to be my authentic self, no matter what platform I'm teaching in? And so here I've listed a few different personas. One that I would be cautious of is using humor. So humor is a really hard thing to portray online. And so I would steer clear of, jokes are good, funny memes are good, keep it animals, right? Like, I think we all have enough logic here to figure this out, but we have to be cautious of culture, of race, and being sensitive to students. So putting up COVID jokes, probably not the best time to do that, right? But having a funny meme of an animal like we did in our opening activity, great way to infuse a little humor into the classroom. Using a funny meme, another great way to infuse it into the online presence. Caring and compassionate attitude. Remember, these are in the words that you're using, right? Trust. Students need to trust that you're going to be there for them, that you're going to act upon something if they need you to, that you're going to be sort of the steady in this. Having that presence, the intentionality, it's one of those things where you have to be intentional about the things that you do, more so in the words that you choose, how you're going to communicate. We've mentioned several times, and I've seen so much of this recently, is flexibility and creativity. And the big one I would stress out of all these is frequent communication. We know that online learners wait. They wait for communication from their instructors. They wait for communication from one another. And so providing a frequent communication and letting them know when they can expect those frequency of communication can eliminate some of the anxiety that they're feeling or angst that they're feeling on the other end. So thinking about these personas, and those are just a list of some. If you had to think about who you are authentic, you're in your most authentic self when you teach, what would be 3 words that you would, or three traits, characteristics that you would describe you want your online persona to be? And it took me a little bit to think about this, even for myself, as I was working through the presentation, as to who would I, what do I really see here for my authentic self? So if you want, you can add those traits or characteristics that you want to bring forward in your online persona in the chat. And if you want to, raise your hand and let us know, well, you can turn your mic off, and we're happy to hear those. It'd be great to hear from our audience members. And so, when I think about my own self, I think about how do I bring forward a caring and kind, compassionate attitude to my students so they recognize that I'm there for them? How do I make sure that I'm supportive? And how do I bring that energy in my words or in a video to my students so that they see that those traits are still there? Sometimes we fall into that being being too academic in our writing because we're so used to that format, but when we're online, we have to let a little bit of our personality come forward, and it's finding that balance between being too colloquial and too academic so students can see that human within us. So if folks want to add their traits to the chat, that'd be great. I'd love to see or hear, for those of you who want to do that, hear from you as well.
So it's interesting, Wanda, you mentioned that finding that balance in the writing. To me, it's finding that in the communication.
Mm-hmm.
I worry about over communication.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading a blog the other day about the death by discussion board. That was the title of the blog, when actually we're trying to rely too much on the discussion board, and we're perhaps sending too many emails out to the learners. So that's, to me, I'm always mindful of keeping the balance where it's frequent communication, and really more important, highlighting for the students when they will hear from me.
Yes, it's the predictability, right?
Exactly.
I used to, when I work with new online instructors, I always tell them, and this is, I'm sorry, this is an aged thing, but I always tell them about the Sunday night radio chats that I think it was President Roosevelt who used to do. And I said, it's sort of like those fireside chats. So just let students know every Sunday evening, by the end of the evening, I will post, and I see it as sort of a synthesis of what happened the week before, a launch forward into the upcoming week, and the expectations for the week in a very crystallized, clear fashion for students. So they know what's coming, they know what to expect. And then they know, okay, I know on Sundays by this time, I should expect an email from my instructor, or Monday mornings, or whatever the date may be. But it allows students then to know when they can expect and where it can be posted. Like right? you go to say that, Klodiana, and I remember reading an article about the same thing where always make sure you're posting, you know, salient information in one spot for students to check, that they don't have to, and think about all the emails that we're getting from multiple sources right now. So thinking about that as well. There's some really lovely traits.
Yeah.
Motivating. Oh, enthusiastic. Yes. Knowledge and wisdom. Being aspirational, engaged, creative, compassion.
Source of knowledge and wisdom. I really like that. Compassion, lots of compassion, humor. Wow, that's aspirational to me, using humor. I can't use humor to save myself. That's not something that I rely on online. But that's excellent to see that other people use humor effectively. Flexibility, yes, absolutely.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, absolutely. Stephanie?
So I want to say how well our presenters are projecting, and something I have observed in the last week is not everybody realizes this, the technical part, where your camera lens is. And so I've learned that having something like this stuck right beside your camera, because we forget where we're looking, and our eyes are still the most powerful communication tool. So having a little or a toy or something that draws your eyes, because once we're communicating, we forget that, and our eyes then move down to the screen to talk back instead of the challenge of bringing our eyes up. So I think that's something I really try to do to try to bridge that physical gap.
Stephanie, now don't pay attention to my visuals, because I'll be trying to do that through the rest of this session. You just gave me a really good tip.
Oh, it's so great that you say that, because I have the same thing on mine, not right now because I'm not, you know, but my eyes keep drifting because, you know, I can see the speaker on the right, and then you're trying to manage the chat. And if you have a spare TA, it's great to have the TAs or somebody monitor the chat, or designate a student to monitor the chat as well, because it is hard to talk, monitor the chat, move your slide forward, process everything that's happening around you. So some great tip there. Yeah, for sure.
Excellent. That's great.
Okay, thanks for sharing. Lovely list. Okay, teaching presence. Teaching presence. So once we've sort of determined the most salient traits, our authentic self that we want to make sure that we're bringing in our online persona, we really need to think then wholeheartedly about how then do we connect our students to each other, our students to the content, and our students with ourselves. And so you can see here from this image, those are really the salient pieces that we want to think about in a communication and interaction with our students and with our content.
And if you want to read the full article, this framework is actually simplified here, but it's taken from the Community of Inquiry by Garrison and Vaughan, and the work that they have done. The work was initially done for blended learning communities, and it applies equally well to online communities. So these are the three areas that they highlight in striving for connection and interactivity. So what are you doing to connect student to student, student to the content or resources, and student to ourselves as educators?
Yeah, and I would just add, it's in an online format, in a remote teaching format, I should say, really.
Yeah.
These are the things you have to be intentional about, right? When you walk into your classroom, you connect with your students, you can see students chatting with one another, they're asking, they're checking in, hey, did you get that? I didn't get that. Okay, tell me about that. But we have to be intentional when we set up those opportunities when we're working remotely with our students. So is there a place on the discussion forums for them to have some sort of interaction outside of maybe, you know, me needing to monitor that? Am I making a spot for them to connect with the content other than just reading the material? Have maybe I presented a few guiding questions for them to consider? And am I intentional about how I've set up my office hours for students still to be able to contact me when they need to?
So what we've done here, we've taken some high impact practices, and again, the reference is there at the end. Some of those come from that reading, and others from things that we've tried ourselves in our own teaching. And these are things that, again, won't come as a surprise to any of you, because just looking at the Google Docs and some of the discussions that we've had already, you've you have already mentioned things like showing our own vulnerability. So how do we actually, first of all, balance rigor and support? But I personally feel that at times like this, in the middle of the crisis, we need to lean a little bit more towards the support. So how are we providing that support? And one way is, again, showing that we're human too, and that we've had to adjust as well, while keeping things casual and lighthearted. So for example, I would say something like, well, in between reading your posts, I would actually go and work on the things that never got done prior to this, such as spring cleaning or fixing the patio. So again, showing how you as an educator have had to adjust, have had to get used to and adapt to these changes.
And
Number two, yeah.
It helps contextualize it for students,
Absolutely.
right? Like, oh, they're feeling that way? Oh, okay,
Yeah.
so I can validate my feeling that way too.
Exactly. Number two, the temperature check. So we started off with those images and asked you to select an image. That was just a quick check-in, just to see how people are feeling right now in the moment as we're all engaged together. Other things I've tried the green, amber, and red. Green is where you've got this, you've adjusted well. Amber is you're on the verge of becoming red. Full of frustrations and anxiety and worries. And red is where you're really in that red zone when you're completely overwhelmed. So again, labeling the emotions and trying to give them the language. Other things, just checking in with the high and low, what's been a high or a low this week, or with image, which is what we tried, or just sharing how they're doing in the form of a weather forecast. And engaging this type of check-in weekly if you can. And I realize not all sessions will be synchronous when you're teaching, but even in an asynchronous format, how can you sort of gauge the temperature? How are people feeling in the moment, and labeling those emotions? Number three there is talking with your students. And I'm finding that even in the chat forum like this, it's difficult to get a sense of individual students and how they are feeling. So if you can use the private function there and privately chat with the student and just quickly say, how are you doing? Or I see you're looking a bit pensive, or I don't know, just something to check in with a student. It's very difficult to understand how can we best support them if we don't actually know what's happening in their lives, if we don't know what is something that, or who is someone that brings them joy and hope at this time. So the more we can learn from our students and what's happening with their lives, then we can think about how can the learning complement their lives rather than complicate their lives in this new reality. So what support do they need? And how can you provide them with this support? And I've done something similar with our school directors. As soon as this started, so I emailed every single one saying, how can I help? And actually it was quite effective, because people came back saying, actually, Klodiana, I'm really struggling with this. Or actually, Klodiana, this resource will be really helpful. So just that simple question, how can I help, to again, complement and support you rather than complicate your life. Mm-hmm. And Wanda alluded to number 4 earlier. Consider perhaps creating a non-academic discussion board or forum where your learners have an opportunity to share phone numbers if they wish. They have an opportunity to talk about anything non-academic, like what's happening with their lives and how can they rely on their peers for that support.
And you know, I would add too, thinking a little bit about TAs, in some of our online courses, we've actually put the TAs in their own discussion forum as well, so that they have a space to sort of support one another if they need to, around questions maybe that they've responded to students or how they're doing with things. So you can certainly isolate groups in the discussion forums in OnCue. So maybe another thing to think about for students or for your TAs as well.
That's a good point. the list continues here with harnessing prior learning and taking advantage of prior learning. In some cases, repetition is desirable, and the evidence actually has shown, or that little evidence that we have collected so far in this area or in the midst of COVID-19, is that mentioning some of the learning that your students have been through has actually been beneficial, because again, it helps normalize it. It helps remind them that, or give them some control and increase their self-efficacy. So this is something that I have control over. I've done this already, and I'm sure I can handle this because it's not foreign to me. It's actually something that I've learned already. So this is the time to maybe go back to some of those things that you've already mentioned in the past. Number 5 there, and I think all of us here mentioned and highlighted and emphasized flexibility. Again, what I'm finding, the number one thing during this crisis has been reframing the learning goals, reframing the assignments and our practices. Because I worry and I'm conscious about access and the digital divide, and how many students will not have access to assignments, access to submit those assignments. So how can we create a variety of pathways for them to be able to complete different assignments and get them to you? Moving on, signs of distress, be those spoken, visual, or written. So how can we, again, raise our own awareness for those signs of distress? And again, I find it's easier perhaps in a face-to-face environment and more difficult to capture online. But this is probably a good time to reacquaint and reconnect and make ourselves aware of what are some of those mental health resources. And when I say mental health resources, I think the point that I want to highlight is connecting students to people, not to services. So we have student wellness, but if we can find out as educators which person in student wellness could support our students, I think I would connect them to that person, not necessarily say student wellness. Even the example that we mentioned earlier with the Big White Wall, which is the virtual online community. So figuring out who are those support people and connecting our learners with those people there.
Can I add just a tip here, Klodiana?
Yeah.
One of the things that I do when I teach online as well, when students, especially right now, when students are under some distress, some level of distress, when they email me a question about an assignment or a task, when I respond, I will start with, hey, by the way, let me know how you're doing. Are you doing okay? How are things going for you? And it's just extending that every time I communicate with them, because it's often I get that email back that says, you know what, I am really struggling and thank you for asking. Or another great tip is to look in OnCue. You can see if your course is in OnCue or you're keeping track of sort of when students log into your courses. You can see the last time a student logged in. And if they haven't logged in for a while, sometimes it's a good just to do a real quick reach out to them and say, hey, you know what, I've noticed you haven't been in virtual class for a while. How are things going? You doing okay? Can I do anything to offer support right now? And that's often those little ways when you get someone to come back to say, you know what, I'm not okay.
And I mean, even regardless of the platform, and that's a good suggestion, Wanda. So some of us will use Elentra and some will use OnCue. So figuring out whichever platform we use, we need to almost expand our way to reaching out to students. I'm thinking for my course that is starting in May, I may even use WhatsApp with some of the students who might not even be in Canada. So thinking of different ways to reach out to the students. Number 6, I mean, how are we modeling ourselves? How are we modeling self-care? And part of that is using that optimistic language. So when you come back this fall, I mean, yes, let's be honest, we actually don't know where things will be at in September, and if we will continue to be teaching online in September. But I think part of it is being optimistic and using that same language. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say let's be a Pollyanna and say that everything is great, because it's not. But thinking about sharing with our students some strategies that we use for our own self-care. And this would also be a good place if you have a reflection assignment in your course that no longer seems relevant, perhaps inviting students to complete or share their own self-care plan might be more relevant. I'm sure you have, again, tons of strategies, and I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to hear some of those later in the breakout room. So I want to make sure, I'm looking at the clock here. And Stephanie, I'm mindful of what you said about looking at the camera as well. But I just want to leave enough room to share other strategies that you might have and figure out a way to leverage those and build on those. Before we get there, though, I just wanted to mention, I don't know how many of you read this article at the Chronicle. Nobody signed up for this. This is a Professor Brendan Bain at UNC, University of North Carolina. What he did, he sent 5 simple points to the students. And I'll just give you a minute. We don't need to go through this. You can read the full article if you click on the link there. But it's really, this is how this instructor had to reshift their goals for the course, their assignments, everything that they do. And just moving on to the other 3 components in that communication that he sent out. Yes, again, I mean, feel free to read the entire article, and the link is in the chat forum. I'm sure all of us have tried different things to communicate to the students that things have shifted, things are not the same. Some expectations, again, are no longer reasonable. We can't even engage in some of the things that we used to do before. So we can't even, I mean, I'm thinking about our clinical placements, and we've had to cancel those. So some things have ceased to exist altogether. Wanda, you're muted.
There we go. Okay, so the last section we're going to talk about is cognitive presence and how do we bring that forward when we're working with students remotely. You can go ahead. Can you forward me there, please? Thanks. Okay, so we think about the 2 different mediums that we have in online learning, right? We have asynchronous, we have synchronous, which means live, like we're doing right now. And so this graphic really goes through when we want to use those things. More importantly, why do we want to use those things, how, and some examples of ways that you can do those things. And so I would just highlight, in keeping in mind that not every learner is going to be able to join synchronous sessions. So think about that when we're working remotely, that there's going to be Wi-Fi issues. And so how can you make sure that we're being equitable to students when we're trying to reach them remotely? And some of the beauties of asynchronous learning, for example, is that you have students who may not otherwise share in class who suddenly have a medium in which they feel comfortable sharing because they've got a different voice in terms of writing and discourse. So something to think about. And other things. So in thinking about hows, discussion forums, but we don't want to overdo those either, because sometimes it is nice to pull into a real platform where we can see people and interact with people. So making sure we balance the differences between those 2 and really thinking about what is it that I'm trying to do, and why is it that I need to use those platforms, and which one's really going to work best. And then the last piece here is the role. So whether you're in an asynchronous or a synchronous platform, sometimes it's nice to think about what role I need to take, or helping your TAs even thinking about a role. It's easy in a classroom to just walk up to a student and discuss and hear and what they're trying to say. It's a little bit harder when you're going, for example, in a live session, in and out of those breakout sessions to talk to students. So some of the things that I like to do is think about these different roles. So how do I keep my group focused when they start to get off task? How do I, oh dear, I lost the screen. There we go. Well, how can I help students connect different ideas? So maybe in one breakout room, they're talking about one thing, and another, they're talking about another. I get to hear those 2 differences, but they don't. So how can I connect some of those ideas? If a student shares something often simply, you may want to say, how can you tell me more? Help me understand why you're thinking that. And again, extend. So if you got a student who's really, students who are really bang on, they get it, they've got the ideas down, and they've made those connections, how can we get them to extend their thinking? And then the key to a lot of this is being the summarizer, the synthesizer. So you have the opportunity to see all of the discussion forums or to be in all the various breakout groups. You have to be the person to pull all of those pieces together. So I often think of online learning like, it's modular, it's separated, and you have to be the person to string those beads together to make it all complete for students. So that's another really important role. And so thinking too in how you're supporting your TAs, sometimes it's nice to define those roles for them so then they have a space to bring forward in those conversations.
Yeah. Thanks, Wanda. So we shared with you some of the strategies that we have used ourselves. I mean, I personally have been teaching online for the past 7 years now. And Wanda, I know, similar, that's the similar.
I actually started designing courses before I taught online, which was like a whole, wow, epiphany. And then I was a student at the very end. So it was kind of a weird path, but it made me understand it so much better.
Because you've seen all the different lenses and perspectives. Yeah, absolutely. And some of the things that are also mentioned in the literature as a high impact practice, I'm sure you're trying different things or maybe some of these strategies as well. So I'd like us to give an opportunity to share what are some of those things that you're trying out. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and create some breakout rooms. And really it's about identifying 3 ways that you can humanize teaching in an online environment. So just bear with me for a second here. Automatically, you'll get a note back, everyone. And thank you for engaging with us in the breakout rooms. I hope you had a productive conversation. Unfortunately, we don't have time left to hear some of the things that you shared in your groups. I also was looking at some of the interesting comments here, and Melissa wrote, this is useful for teaching, but the idea of online presence and connectedness is also important for those clinicians who are trying to establish virtual connections with patients. And absolutely, Melissa, the social online presence, it's all about connecting with the other, and the other could be the learner, could be a patient, could be a colleague. So yes, I couldn't agree more. Thank you for that comment. Other comments as well? Yeah, excellent. So we've come to the end of our hour together. We'd like to leave you with this one quick reflection. What is one commitment that you will make after today's discussion? And that commitment could be, it could be personal, a strategy that you want to do, or something that you're already using and emphasizing that further, or it could be organizational, perhaps reviewing a policy that's in place or talking to a colleague. So just take 30 seconds to think about that commitment. And some are feeling brave to share that commitment on the chat. Thank you, Robin. We do want to mention some resources. There is a link that is called Care in Uncertain Times. And this one has many, many books on care in uncertain times, and they're all, you can all access them for free until the end of June. So they've made them available for everyone, and the link is at the very bottom here. And we're happy to, we'll be uploading the slides on the faculty development homepage and the recording as well. So you can see them here, or if you want me to send them to you, just let me know and I can send them to you directly. The next slide has also more resources that we've used for this session. So if you want to dig deeper and you want to read further about compassion in online learning, or asynchronous and synchronous learning, or humanizing online teaching, all those references are there as well. I see a comment about excellent strategies in our breakout room. Maybe those could be collected. Stephanie, I don't think I'll be able to do that, as I'm not sure which room you were in. If you know the people in the breakout room, and if you want to message them privately, or maybe I can tell everyone or invite everyone to add them to that Google Docs that we had at the very beginning, I think that would be quite useful. And then both Wanda and I can share that with everyone. Thank you, James.
Oh, good suggestion, James.
Thank you. That's a good suggestion as well. Okay. Other than that, that's it from us. Thank you so much for joining us. The time flew by quickly, as it always does. If there are any quick comments or questions, please unmute yourself and let us know. If not, our emails are here, so you can reach out to us privately, and we can address it that way.
That was great. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Klodiana.
Thank you, Wanda. Oh, hi, Jessica. Bye, Jessica.
Thanks, James. Good seeing you.
James, thanks for joining us. Oh, Beata. Take care, everyone. I will end the recording.
Thanks, all.
Thank you, everyone.